They didn't conscript me to fight. I want that said plainly, because everything that happened after started from that one clerical fact. I was 34, a hydroponics tech from a farming moon nobody in the Empire could find on a star chart without help, and when the draft notice came, it didn't ask if I could shoot. It asked if I'd ever raised livestock. I had. Goats mostly, and a blind mule named Ander that outlived 3 owners before me. So they put a stamp on my file that said penkeeper, husbandry aptitude, and shipped me to Corvith Muster Depot to mind the war beasts instead of carrying a rifle. I wasn't disappointed. I'd seen what the rifles were for. The transport that brought me in passed low over a staging field stacked with returned kit boots, mostly, more boots than I wanted to count, sorted by size for reissue because the Empire didn't waste good leather on sentiment. I decided somewhere over that field that I'd rather smell like a barn for the rest of the war than end up sorted into a pile like that, and nothing that happened afterward gave me a reason to reconsider. The denwards sat at the low end of the depot, past the barracks and the drill yards, a long row of iron-slatted pens that smelled like wet fur and old blood, and underneath that, something almost sweet, milk, I realized eventually, because most of what we kept back there were cubs. The Empire bred Kelvin on a dozen worlds for the Beast Corps, thick-boned, bare-shouldered things with black-brown hides and hands broader than dinner plates, meant to grow into the armored shock troops that walked point ahead of the infantry. Grown, a Kelvin could take a plasma bolt to the chest and keep coming. As cubs, they were clumsy and loud, and if you weren't careful, they'd fall asleep in your lap before you got the evening feed poured. I was given 11 of them to keep and one I kept for myself, without meaning to. His number was row 4, cub 9. Everyone else called him the runt. I called him Grum, because that was the sound he made instead of the low warning growl the assessors wanted, and it seemed rude not to name a thing that talked to you every day. Grum was the problem child of the litter, not because he bit or broke fence rails, the opposite. Put a training dummy in front of him with the aggression triggers on, and every other cub in the denwards would go for the throat. Grum would sniff it, decide it wasn't food, and wander off to see what I was doing. The assessors marked this down as failure to engage 3 separate times, and the 3rd time carries consequences in the Beast Corps. A Kelvin that won't fight isn't worth its feed allotment. They call the ones that don't improve. I didn't set out to fix that. I just didn't like eating alone. It started the 2nd week. I'd sit on the overturned feed drum after evening chow, working through my own ration, and Grum would come sit against my leg the way a cub does when it hasn't decided yet whether you're pack or furniture. I split my bread with him, then my meat. It wasn't sentiment, or it wasn't only that. A cub who trusts you enough to take food from your hand instead of the trough is a cub you can actually work with, and I needed him tractable if I was going to keep him off the cull list. So every night before I ate, Grum ate first. The keeper too rose down. A broad-shouldered woman named Priska who'd drawn the litter's other runt, started doing the same thing inside a month. Then the boy working row 7. By the time the drill sergeants noticed, half the denwards had picked up the habit without any of us calling it anything. The recruits noticed first, the way recruits notice everything that isn't marching. They'd walk past at evening muster and see 6 grown men and women sitting on feed drums letting bear-sized war beasts eat off their own plates before touching their own food. And somebody, I never learned who, started calling it the first portion doctrine, like it was a real regulation instead of a joke about soft-hearted pen keepers. It should have died there. Instead, the joke got copied along with the habit, because it turned out something we hadn't planned on. The cubs that got fed first, every single time without fail, grew into war beasts that didn't need aggression triggers to be loyal. They came when called. They fell in beside their keeper without a leash. Officers who'd never have said it out loud started requesting pen keepers who ran the first portion for their squad assignments, because a Kelvin raised that way didn't need managing. It just stayed close. Grum grew the way Kelvin grow, which is to say alarmingly. By midsummer he was the size of the mule I'd raised back home, and I had to start feeding him from a bucket instead of my open palm just to keep my fingers. By autumn, he could rest his chin on my shoulder while I stood, which he did constantly, uninvited, usually while I was trying to mend fence. The other keepers took to warning new arrivals that the depot's biggest war beast was also its gentlest, and that they'd know row 4's cub by the way he leaned his whole weight into you like a building deciding to lie down. By the depot's assessment day, 10 months after I'd first split my bread with him, he stood taller at the shoulder than I did at the crown, and he still followed me around the denwards like something out of a children's story, still sat when I sat, still wouldn't so much as growl at a training dummy no matter how many times they ran the drill. That was the problem. Assessment day existed to decide which cubs shipped out with the Corps and which ones didn't, and the standard hadn't changed. Aggression. Kill drive. Grum, for all his size, had never once shown either, and the officer running that year's board was a narrow, precise man named Vesic Dre who did not believe in exceptions. He read Grum's file in front of the whole assembled denwards, out loud, the way some men do things specifically so you'll have to watch. Failure to engage 3 times over. Failure again, a 4th on the record now. He said the word cull the way another man might say return to sender, like it cost him nothing. I asked if I could speak, which pen keepers weren't strictly permitted to do at an officer's board, and he let me, mostly I think because he wanted an audience for the refusal that was coming. I told him Grum had never lost a keeper, never broken a fence, never once turned on a soul in 10 months of handling, and that loyalty like that didn't grow on every litter and shouldn't be thrown away because it didn't come dressed as a snarl. Dre said the Corps needed weapons, not pets, and gestured for the handlers to bring the cull cage forward. That was when the denwards did something I hadn't asked for and couldn't have arranged if I'd tried. Every Kelvin raised on the first portion, 11 of them by then, full grown. Each one still following whichever keeper had fed them first for 10 straight months, walked out of formation without a command and stood between the cull cage and Grum. Not snarling, not lunging, just standing, a wall of black-brown shoulder and quiet breathing, immovable as depot stone, while their keepers stood frozen and half of them looked as surprised as Dre did. Dre ordered them moved. Nobody moved them. He ordered the handlers to force the issue, and the handlers, good sense being what it is, declined to put their hands on 11 adult war beasts standing shoulder to shoulder for a reason nobody had trained into them. It was Grum who ended it in the end, and he did it the only way he knew how. Dre, red-faced, stepped past the line himself to reach for the cull cage's latch, and Grum came off his haunches between one breath and the next, put himself squarely in front of me, and let out a sound I'd never once heard from him in 10 months, low, full-chested, final. Not a threat toward the keepers or the assembled recruits. Just a wall going up around the one man he decided was his. Dre stopped like he'd walked into glass. He looked around at his own inspectors, at 100 watching recruits, at 11 grown war beasts and one officer's authority evaporating in real time, and he found, I imagine, that there was no dignified way to force a cull through that. He canceled the assessment, logged Grum as conditional retention, further observation, and walked off the yard without looking back at any of us. He never did regain his footing with that board after. I heard, months later, they reassigned him to depot inventory. They wrote the first portion into the Corps, handling manual the following spring, official language and all, feed the youngest first, regardless of assessed aggression. I still have the requisition slip with my name on it as the originating keeper, which strikes me as a strange thing to be proudest of, out of everything I did in that war. But I am. Grum still follows me when I walk the denwards, still sits when I sit, still eats first. Some of the officers call that discipline now. I call it what it always was, a man who didn't like eating alone, and a cub who decided, quietly and completely, to be family instead of a weapon.